So my name is Arya, and for my project, I decided to do the empathy interview. I wanted to interview my grandparents because I think this project gave me a chance to. I mean, they actually live with me, but this project gave me the chance to talk to them about things that have been unspoken in my mind, and I kind of wanted to elaborate on them more and get to know what is actually happening there and kind of how those feelings have developed or possibly even changed. So just a little overview. This is a picture actually from around, I want to say 15, 16 years ago. And so on the right is my grandpa. His name is Avinash. Oh, on the left is my grandpa. His name's Avinash. And then on the right is my grandma. Her name is Shraddha. And then that's me and my brother when we were like really little. Okay, so who is my project about? So these are my maternal grandparents. So they were both born in India in the state of Maharashtra. You probably don't know what that is, but if you've heard of the city of Mumbai, it's basically the state that holds that city. And so they were actually both born in Mumbai, and they were born relatively close to each other. My grandma was born in 1951, my grandpa in 1945. So in Maharashtra, the state where they're from, the language that is spoken is Marathi. And so I actually speak Marathi as well in my house. And in our language, we don't say grandma or grandpa. We say aji for grandma and azoba for grandpa. So both my grandparents, even from the old days in like the 1950s, they've been relatively modern because their own parents were relatively modern. So a lot of people back then had like arranged marriages because that's just a cultural tradition. But my grandparents, it was technically an arranged marriage, but it was more like the families told each other, oh, you guys might be compatible. You guys can test out the waters and see what happens. And it was honestly really different compared to that time period because it was more customary for there to be like 2 or 3 meetings and then a wedding. And it was more like decided by the parents of the family, not really the people who were getting married themselves. Another thing I was really interested to learn about, which I actually didn't know, what it's just kind of embarrassing because my grandparents literally live with me, was that my grandma actually had a job from a very young age. When she was around 19 or so, she used to work at the mail facility where my grandpa actually worked before he retired. And so they both worked there as well, which I thought was really cool that they had that connection outside of just their marriage. Now my grandma actually teaches yoga, which is another thing I found to be really cool, that she's still continuing to work and like doing something with her life, which I find to be really, really inspiring. So what was my presentation about? For the most part, I know a lot about my grandparents' lives, but there are things that I know from my mom that make me a little bit uncomfortable. And I hadn't really been, I guess, brave enough to talk about them until now. So one of the biggest things is the marriage of my mom to my dad. So my mom's name is Arundhati, and she has a younger sister named Arti. And so my aunt Arti Maushi, she lives in India. And so that's my dad in the picture, and his name is Shiv. And so the big thing there was that my parents met in college. And my dad, he kind of had like a rough growing up. He didn't have a great childhood, and he had a rough life. He really had to make it from his own. So my mom came from a middle class family, and though they weren't super rich or affluent, it was still the norm. They were still right there in the socially acceptable line. So my dad, he's not even actually Maharashtrian. He's from a southern state called Tamil Nadu, and he moved to Maharashtra with his parents when he was very young. And then his parents unfortunately died when he was around 13 or 14. And then he had to take care of both himself and his younger brother. And that was really, really hard. They had like no money, and they had to like save literally page by page to have notebooks. And he barely pulled himself through college. So when my mom met my dad and they started dating, though my grandparents were never outspokenly against it, there was definitely a bias. For one, my dad wasn't as quote unquote well educated as they would like my mom's potential husband to be. He wasn't rich. And then a big thing, which is really unfortunate in Indian culture, is that there's a lot of colorism. Fair-skinned people are preferred, especially in comparison to dark skinned people. And my dad was considered darker skinned. Plus, he was from South India, which is not a region like very close to Maharashtra. So though they were never out like explicitly saying, "Oh, don't marry him because he's dark skinned," they were never really open or friendly to him either. And that was because of this colorist mindset they had. And I guess an appropriate term to label this would be, it was microaggressions against my dad. And it was kind of like, I didn't really like it. This always makes me feel emotional and almost like mad to learn about this, because even though they like never like said it, the things they would do were really unfair. My aunt, she married a Maharashtrian fair-skinned man. And so, for example, like just to kind of put in perspective what I'm talking about the different treatment. For my mom's wedding, they gave her and my dad one singular wedding invitation for all their friends. And then my aunt, for her wedding, they printed out like hundreds of them. And my mom's wedding was really, really small. My aunt's wedding was big. And there was just always more support for that relationship than my mom's relationship with my dad. And that was something I think that really persevered for a while until they moved here. So in the 2000s, my parents immigrated from India to America. And from the 2000s, my grandparents also started making frequent trips to America. In 2003, when I was born, they got a green card here. And so they started basically almost living here. And I think that was when they started to come out of this prejudice. When I spoke to them, though, like they never really admitted to being, colorist or anything, but they did talk about their development and how their perspective changed. So, so how could I put this in words without sounding like condescending? For example, I think the biggest thing was that since they came to a different country, America, they kind of got separated from the socially acceptable norm in India, which is that people had to look a certain way, which is a lighter skinned, and they had to manage their family a certain way, which was very different than the way my parents managed their family. And being here, they really started to change their own perspective in that way. A really cool way, I think, to visualize this is through these three pictures, which take the span of different time periods. The first two pictures are around 5 years apart. And then the next two pictures, they're like 15 years apart. And you can just visually see the change. Coming to America, I think for a lot of immigrant grandparents, it can be a daunting thing. But I think it honestly changed my grandparents for the better. Coming here now, because of coming here, my grandpa now regards my dad, who he used to have a lot of prejudice towards, as one of the men he respects the most in like this whole planet. And I thought that was really admirable to see how that perspective changed just from being separated from such a blurry and antagonistic viewpoint that he was used to. Another thing that I thought was really, really cool, and I actually didn't expect this to happen, was that my grandparents were way more accepting of American culture than I thought they would be. And it was like in a multicultural way as well. It wasn't just like, oh, they were liking American food. It was like they were interacting with other cultures in a positive light. For example, my grandpa, he actually has a lot of other elderly friends who are of a different race. And so one time I was just walking with him and he met one of his friends. He's an elderly Mexican gentleman. And both my grandpa and this Mexican gentleman, they don't really speak English well, but they speak their native languages of Spanish and Marathi well. And it was just amazing to me because they were communicating with each other using their own languages. They weren't using a shared language at all, but they were still understanding what the other person said. And I thought that was just amazing to see how like communication can happen beyond just words and how you can actually understand through that communication as well. I thought that was something really interesting. And when I actually asked my grandpa about like how he understood and how he got to know all that, he was like, you just know when you spend time with that person, sometimes you don't even have to speak. You just know. And I thought that was very interesting because that was very applicable as well to how he approached my dad with a new attitude. So basically my project, I know I've talked a lot about a little like different things here and there, was kind of a track of this development from India to America, from a negative viewpoint of my parents' marriage to a positive viewpoint. And then just like how their cultural assimilation wasn't cultural assimilation, it was acceptance of both cultures as at once. And I thought that's really, really cool. And so that's basically what I elaborate on more on my project. Thank you so much for listening.